Before the United States of America became a country, it was a scattered collection of 13 British colonies, each one a world unto itself, different people, different economies, different ideals, and yet, through conflict, compromise, survival, and rebellion, they forged something no one thought possible: unity. This is the story of how those early colonies laid the foundation for a new nation. "13 scattered settlements, 13 different ambitions, and one impossible dream: to become a single nation." Long before the United States of America even existed, the original colonies were 13 experiments in survival, power, and identity. The story of how they united isn't just about a war and independence. It's about the strange, fragile, and at times chaotic path that turned scattered lands into a single voice. Before the British claimed control, the land that would become the 13 colonies was a battleground for European ambitions. Spanish voyages led by explorers like Columbus kicked off a race across the Atlantic. His journeys, although never touching future U.S. soil, sparked Spain's claim in the Americas, and led to the founding of St. Augustine in Florida, the first permanent European settlement in what is now the United States. But Spain was not alone. The French explored the vast waterways of the north. Jacques Cartier moved up the St. Lawrence River in the 1530s. His countrymen eventually built early settlements across parts of Canada. Meanwhile, the Dutch and the Swedish carved out pieces of the Middle Atlantic, establishing roots in areas like New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. Control shifted over the decades. In 1607, England established its first lasting colony in Jamestown, Virginia. Then came the Pilgrims, who landed at Plymouth in 1620 and built lives shaped by their strict religious beliefs. As colonization accelerated, British military strength, tested in wars such as the Anglo-Spanish conflicts, Anglo-Dutch naval clashes, and King Philip's War, solidified dominance along the Atlantic coast. One by one, all 13 colonies came under British control, with Georgia completing the set in 1732. Not all the colonies were alike. Geography divided them and shaped their lives. Up north, the New England colonies, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, were rugged, forested, and cold. Their rocky land was not suited for large farms. However, their deep harbors facilitated trade, and towns like Boston became symbols of colonial defiance and identity. Patriots like Nathan Hale and cousins Samuel and John Adams would rise from this region. These colonies, wedged between French territories to the north and Spanish holdings to the south, were shaped not just by climate and landscape, but by their precarious position in a contested new world. Further south, the Middle Colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, enjoyed a gentler climate, rolling landscapes, and wide rivers. These lands fed cities like Philadelphia and New York, and gave rise to figures such as Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, who would one day shape the foundations of the new country. Then came the South: Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, where heat, rivers, and fertile land made plantations flourish. Southern landowners amassed their wealth on the backs of enslaved people, and the economy was largely driven by crops such as tobacco, cotton, and rice. Virginia, the largest of all the colonies, produced some of America's most influential leaders, including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. Every colony had its own way of life, its own rhythm, but certain patterns emerged. In New England, because the rocky soil made large farms impossible, families survived through small-scale farming, fishing, hunting, and trade along the sea. Education there was central, fueled by Puritan values. This was a region where ideas mattered, where universities like Harvard and Yale first took root. Society in New England was shaped by its deep religiosity and strong sense of community, which fostered a highly educated population. Politics in this region was intensely local. Town meetings brought people together to make decisions, and this tight-knit governance gave New Englanders a sense of control over their own affairs. Their growing frustration with distant British authority would eventually become the spark that lit the fire of rebellion. In the Middle Colonies, diversity wasn't just tolerated, it was built into the fabric. The legacy of Dutch, German, Swedish, and English settlers created a patchwork of cultures. Large cities like Philadelphia and New York reflected this blend, buzzing with commerce and ideas. The fertile fields earned them the nickname the breadbasket, and over time, these colonies became a critical pathway for freed slaves traveling north via the Underground Railroad. The Southern colonies followed a different path. Agriculture reigned supreme. Wealth and land shaped society into a rigid hierarchy. The elite ruled from plantations, and slavery became the backbone of the Southern economy. These colonies were organized in a more aristocratic structure, where social and political power were concentrated in the hands of wealthy landowners. While New England embraced change, the South clung more tightly to its traditions, and the cultural divide between these regions only deepened over time. As our picture of colonial life comes into focus, it's time to examine how power was distributed. Though they all eventually flew the same flag, the colonies didn't all follow the same rules. Some colonies, like Virginia and the Carolinas, were royal, governed by officials appointed by the crown. Others, like Pennsylvania, were proprietary, run by individuals granted power by the king. A few, including Rhode Island and Connecticut, were corporate and chose their own leaders. But across the board, one thing was constant. Power was limited to landowning men. Colonial assemblies provided a voice for the elite, but the most meaningful decisions often came from local governance. In New England, neighbors debated and voted in town meetings. In the South, county systems enabled the wealthiest individuals to influence local decisions. Despite their differences, these local institutions empowered colonists to shape their own lives, even as British control tightened. From far across the ocean, Britain still called the shots on trade and taxes in the colonies. Under the rules of mercantilism, the colonies were expected to enrich the empire by exporting more goods than they imported and relying on Britain for their needs. Overseas trade was restricted, and manufacturing that could compete with English industries was discouraged. Over time, the colonists began to question this arrangement. Why were they taxed, yet voiceless in British Parliament? Why were they being used to serve an empire that gave them so little in return? The seeds of revolution were being planted. Long before the Declaration of Independence, the colonies were already familiar with war. During Queen Anne's War, the colonies clashed with French and Spanish forces and their Native American allies up and down the continent. From northern fronts in Canada to southern campaigns in Florida and Alabama, violence reached every corner of the 13 colonies. The Treaty of Utrecht ended the fighting in 1713, giving Britain new territories in Canada. But this peace did not last. Just decades later, Britain and France collided again in the French and Indian War, battling for control of the Ohio Valley. It was part of a larger global conflict, and it brought key American figures such as George Washington onto the stage for the first time. The war ended in British victory, sealed by the Treaty of Paris in 1763. France gave up vast territories, and Britain stood alone in control. But that victory came with a heavy cost. War had drained the British coffers. To pay for it, Parliament looked to its colonies and demanded even more taxes. What began as a financial recovery plan soon became a lightning rod for discontent. For many colonists, this marked the beginning of a breakdown in trust, a shift from loyalty to suspicion, from partnership to outright protest. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, each new tax hit the colonists hard, and with each law passed by Parliament, the anger in the colonies burned hotter. The colonists believed that being taxed without a voice in Parliament was unjust, and they weren't quiet about it. At first, Britain attempted to ease the tension, but the damage had been done. When British soldiers fired into a crowd during the Boston Massacre, it sparked outrage. Then came the Boston Tea Party, a dramatic act of rebellion that Britain answered with even harsher laws. The Intolerable Acts only served to push colonists further towards resistance. Leaders like Patrick Henry, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson began to gather in earnest. The First Continental Congress was held, then the Second, and then finally the spark. Shots fired at Lexington and Concord. The Revolutionary War had begun. 1 year later, the colonies officially declared their independence, but putting their ideas into ink was only the beginning. The war stretched on for 6 long years. George Washington led the Continental Army, pulling together militias from every colony. When Lord Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, the colonies had achieved the impossible. They had won. In 1781, the 13 colonies came together under the Articles of Confederation. But unity was still fragile. Federalists like Hamilton and Madison believed it wasn't enough. They fought for a new constitution, one that would strengthen the bond between states. By 1789, that vision became a reality, and the United States of America was officially born. That original union stretched from the rocky coasts of New England to the warm shores of Georgia. It included Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut in the north, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware in the middle, and Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia in the south. 13 distinct pieces, stitched together into the fabric of a new republic. The story of the 13 colonies is one of collision. Of cultures, of economies, of ideals. From scattered settlements claimed by rival empires to a unified front fighting for independence, the 13 colonies laid the foundation for a nation. Each region brought its own strengths, struggles, and contradictions, and together, through conflict and compromise, they became something new. Not just colonies, but states. Not just subjects, but citizens. Not just survivors of a war, but founders of a country that continues to evolve today.